Welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Lee Kaplan. Antonio Gramsci is often remembered through a single image, the imprisoned intellectual, the theorist of hegemony, and the author of the Prison Notebooks. His concepts have traveled across disciplines from political theory and cultural studies to education, media, and postcolonial thought. Yet in becoming an icon, Gramsci has also been flattened into a head without a body, a thinker detached from the material conditions that made his thought possible. Joining me today are Mauro Puddu and theorist Saskia Kroonenberg to discuss their co-authored piece, written on the Subaltern Body, Gramsci and the Material Politics of Sardinian and Italian Prison Lives, a work that brings together archaeology, literary studies, history, and materialist philosophy to rethink Gramsci through bones, objects, illness, food, labor, and imprisonment. Rather than treating Gramsci as an isolated genius, they reconstruct the social and bodily world that produced his political imagination. Through osteobiography, archaeological evidence, prison letters, and historical archives, they reveal how colonialism, poverty, disability, nutrition, and everyday material life become conditions of thought itself. If you like what we do here, please subscribe at patreon.com/everythingisideology or become a one-time donor at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. All right. Hello and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. We're joined by Mauro Puddu and Saskia Kroonenberg. And Mauro Puddu is an Italian archaeologist whose research focuses on the Roman world, particularly the archaeology of identity, mobility, and marginalized communities in the ancient Mediterranean. He is currently a young researcher at the University of Foreigners of Siena, where he leads the PAAST project, which examines mobility and social inequality in Roman period Sardinia through post-humanist, feminist, and archaeological approaches. He earned his BA and MA in archaeology from the University of Calgary, a second MA in theoretical archaeology from the University College of London, and a PhD in classics from the University of Cambridge. And his work has appeared in leading journals such as the Cambridge Archaeological Journal and the Theoretical Roman Archaeology Journal. We're also joined by Saskia Kroonenberg, who's a scholar in cultural studies at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Her main interests include Italian literature, Antonio Gramsci, who obviously is the star, more or less, today, as well as the bones of his comrades and fellows, and gender and postcolonial studies. As a fellow at Inherent, Heritage in Transformation, she is currently working on combining insights from epigenetics with literary research. She was previously a Marie Curie Fellow at the ARTES Graduate School for the Humanities in Cologne. She has been a visiting fellow at the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome and the Erich Auerbach Institute for Advanced Studies in Cologne, the University of Zurich, and Utrecht University. For her PhD on Gramsci's political philosophy, postcolonial literature, and new materialism, she received Antonio Gramsci's dissertation prize of the AK Vine and University of Belfield. So thank you so much. It's great to be with such sort of esteemed colleagues and thinkers, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't you start by kind of telling us about this piece and the ways in which your field sort of situate the methodology. So it seems like you're doing a lot of interdisciplinary work that's actually deeply materialistic in a way that Gramsci deeply would have appreciated as well. So in a way, you're sort of like returning the body to Gramsci. And I thought it was kind of really profound not to kind of do too much of a sort of, what is it called? When you give away the plot to something. Not too much of like giving away sort of the plot or whatever it is. But, you know, looking at the headshot of Gramsci, just his head, eliminates aspects of the body and makes him more of sort of like a thinker, disconnected from materialist struggle in very interesting and profound ways. So I was hoping you could kind of situate us and tell about the piece of this and also perhaps even the writing process of working with one another.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Well, first of all, thank you, Lee, for having us and at your podcast. This is fantastic, and we couldn't wait to start chatting with you about all of this. So thank you for the invitation, first of all, and congratulations on the podcast. First of all, it started. This article started. It looks at the way Gramsci's thought was produced by his life together with his contemporaries. And while we focus on how Gramsci met people and people met Gramsci and his thought arose from those kind of situations, it is kind of interesting, probably for the listeners, to say that an interdisciplinary work doesn't really start from one person having specific questions and then asking other people to do specific things for them. But like in this case, Saskia and I were very, very lucky. We met at a great Italian studies conference in London exactly 2 years ago. And Saskia was working on the writings of Antonio Gramsci, and I was working on the application of Antonio Gramsci's postcolonial theory, well, Antonio Gramsci's subaltern theory, to archaeological remains of the past. I listened to Saskia's work, I read her work, and I was like, wow. Well, first of all, I was slightly worried because I had ideas that she was already writing about. And I was like, oh my God, am I being scooped? And then we met and she was fantastic. And almost immediately we felt at this session on postcolonial Gramsci that the possibility was to collaborate with each other. What do you think, Saskia?
Yeah, so this is how we met at this conference. And then we just said, oh, how lovely would it be to do something on Gramsci's bones and words and things in his life? And then we just started talking and making some notes. And then, over time it grew. And it was just a lot of fun to work with you and to ask these questions with you. And then in the end, we created this article. It was just a lot of fun also.
Not effortless at all, because we needed to go through a little exercise of translation between the different tools that we use. But the fun part was probably realizing after making an effort that different disciplines are kind of converging towards similar aims and scopes, which is like, what do we do with these huge archives of the people's lives that are not necessarily part of history, and what do we do with the very sanitized and neat monolithic figures we already know, but we know that they had a life of themselves, and there was not at all independent from the rest of the world. So that's how we started, and the writing became it was challenging at first, but this is part of the interdisciplinary process, and then it became really smooth. I think to this day, if you point at a specific part of the article, I am not entirely sure if I wrote it, Saskia wrote it, or like how the process went, who we wrote it together in a way.
Yeah. And I think in the whole process, of course, we were very much inspired by Gramsci himself, who writes about the subaltern history, that it is kind of that it's very hard to write about histories of those who were not in power, the forgotten ones, the racialized, the marginalized. And that the history of the subalterns is necessarily fragmented and episodic and hard to find. So we wanted to look for the other traces that were not only written in the official documents. And that's, I think, one of our starting points. And then throughout the process, a lot of times I felt we had, we discovered something, this is genius, or about, I don't know, about food. And then we found out, Gramsci also actually had this thought in his time about the importance of food for the health of a population, and on so many layers, Gramsci was like, I don't know. I felt like we were kind of repeating him in a way, or discovering new ways of reading him.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel the same way sort of about Marx in many ways. It's sort of like every thought in some way, even thinking about the body as a form of technology that develops over time, is sort of like pieced together in the quote unquote like young Marx thing, if we use like the Althusserian kind of language and whatnot, of like the distinction of his life. And I find that like even like a lot of sociological work is tried to reframe or get away from Marx in different ways. And for different maybe political purposes or like academic philosophy sort of purpose in different ways. But there's something sort of similar happening within Gramscian thought and the use of kind of Gramscian discourse in many different ways, like the use of hegemonic and all these other phrases and whatnot. become kind of very commonplace and extremely useful, but they're not really connected to the actual like sort of political reality and the bodily reality that Gramsci lived within. So it's kind of crazy to think about, there's this person sort of starving in a fascist prison who's writing this incredibly complicated, nuanced stuff in a fragmentary way. So his writings very much mimic his embodied experience of only having sort of glimpses and moments of being a self, of being a person. And, the food stuff is incredibly important because it's like within sort of one thing, you see the totality. So within kind of seeing like how much meat you consume or whether or not you can consume meat, and who consumes meat, you could actually see the entire social reproductive system of a particular social ecosphere. And that's something that comes out really interestingly. I don't think too many people are thinking about like, whether or not Gramsci had prosciutto or not, right? And I just thought like, not only does this deeply humanize the person, but this is the fuel that led to him being able to write in different ways. So if he's thinking about sort of social reproduction, I think it's incredibly useful to think about the ways in which the subaltern is also socially reproduced in such a way as to like do the work in different ways. And he was writing under such extreme conditions. A lot of times in kind of like academic settings, we critique ourselves like, oh, we're writing about, sort of like revolutions in the subaltern while doing so in a very comfortable place. So this gives us a space to kind of like think through what it means to write in a quote unquote like privileged vantage point about someone that's like starving in a fascist prison and whatnot. Now, you touched on some of the tools that you use. In archaeology, tools is not just like a sort of abstract rhetorical device, but you actually use tools, hammers, and all of these other sort of chisels and whatnot, right? So I was hoping, can you talk about some of the tools you use, specifically like terms like osteobiographical, interwoven registers, bones, words, objects, the sort of particular kind of methodological tools you use to flesh this out. And I guess I use the word flesh very purposely here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. There are very, very many tools that are used in archaeology, from the very physical ones that you will use to unearth something or to see something. The first tools are your feet and your legs. You walk a lot in fields to find out how the landscape works around you and what kind of signs you can find about previous lives. So there's a lot of walking. Then when the site is highlighted, there is a lot of digging and sieving, mattocks and trowel. It can be pretty physical. At the same time, you are thinking of what's happening, like what are the layers and how are they connected to each other. And osteobiography, particularly, is a direction of this branch of archaeology called bioarchaeology, whereby rather than focusing exclusively on artifacts that have been until very recently the focus of archaeology to reconstruct previous lifestyles. Right now, the idea is to look at how the bones are geared to tell us more about the lives that specific individual lived. So rather than looking at a lot of material culture and, for example, reconstruct the economy through the analysis of products that circulated, for instance, in a specific period like the Roman world or the early capitalist era, you can also dive into the specific experience of that world of a specific person. And the bones are extremely plastic in a way that they react to the stimuli around us. I don't know if you know the famous song by Brandy Carlile, The Story. It says, all of the lines across your face tell you the story of who I am. Basically, like the facial expressions tell us about the lives of the person we are meeting, and the bones in several thousands of years will preserve these impact lines that they will tell us how the person was nourished throughout their lifetime. If there was a period of famine, for example, if there was a period of lack of specific nutrients or a period of lack of exposure to light. And all of these things have an impact on the body and on the bones. And by studying the bones, you can really try to reconstruct the lifespan of an individual. And this is where the other registers come in, like the objects and the words. if you are lucky enough to have many sources, like written sources and objects, you can try to tell how these different sources overlap or contradict each other. Sometimes historical sources are made to ideologically represent something that it wasn't there. So looking at the bones will tell us another reality, not necessarily truer than the one told by texts or objects, very complementing each other, like, or maybe different. And that's where Saskia and I are working so greatly on written sources, and I tried to do archaeology. We were like, probably we should look at these things together.
Yeah, and it was so nice to. Our idea was that on the one hand we could look at the stress markers on the bones, which tell a certain narrative in a way, or which tell a certain history. And we thought, maybe then the Gramsci's testimony of his life in prison, of his youth, of the food, the lack of certain nutrients during his childhood, maybe we can also see these testimonies as a kind of, maybe we can find some symptoms or some kind of, we can do a kind of analysis of, in terms of health and circumstances, combining the testimony and the bones is another form of testimony.
Yeah, no, I thought that was incredibly brilliant, and also it makes for a very robust materialistic analysis, because you're literally actually looking at the physical material of a person, of a thing. And I thought one thing that was really interesting was the kind of where you got the material from. So I think a lot of academic literature has been dealing with or thinking through like terms of death. So there's a lot of stuff like studying cemeteries and what they do, and digging up bones, and kind of like thinking about bodies and life worlds and death worlds and all of these things. And I thought it would be really interesting to hear a little bit about where you found these bones, because you're not specifically talking about Gramsci's body. Like, you're not using Gramsci's like biological sort of remains. Rather, you're relying on the people he sort of like lived with it in the time period. So I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about like sort of the evidence and the bones and where you got this sort of material, and even the 3 case studies you look at. And then we could extrapolate from there, but I think that would be quite useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall I go, Saskia?
Yes.
Okay. And maybe you can say why we didn't focus exclusively on Gramsci's body, but yeah, we focus on 3 case studies from West Central Sardinia, which is an area where Gramsci was born and lived his the first. He lived his youth until going to university to Turin, and these bones are coming from a clearance of graves, ossuaries really, which is a container of multiple bones of, let's say, so-called ancient or older but modern graves that were cleared to make space for new burials in the cemetery. This is a process that happens every century, every certain years, and they were thankfully in the process of clearance in the early 2000s. They were all of these bones were rescued by a project of the University of Cagliari, Sardinia, that tried to look at them individually and try to see what kind of pathologies they were showing. And you have a series of bones that go from the very ancient, like Punic and Roman, something also Roman period, to up to the 19th and 20th century. So you have a very varied register of what was happening to whom in different periods. The reason why we decided to look at 3 specific case studies is that they come from towns like Ales, that are very close to where Gramsci was born and lived. And the second is we did want to focus on them because they have been, yes, rescued from the University of Cagliari project, and they are being looked at. So they are kind of brought back to life, but they are, let's say, detached from the life that the person's bone lived. What we are trying to do is to bring them together in a way that desanitizes the clinical process of looking at a bone specifically as a source for a symptom, and say, okay, if this symptom existed, it is because this person was living probably this kind of life. And we try to reconstruct what kind of life these people were living, which was a life marked by hard work, difficulty in finding the right nutrients, and also a life of coexistence with pain. Like these people, when you see specific marks on the bones, is because the fractures or the signs of fatigues were kept by the person who kept living. Like this person didn't die of an injury; they kept living with it. So there is also a sort of resistance to injury. And by looking at the people around Gramsci, we were thinking maybe who were living around this same period and around the same area. We were thinking of expanding Gramsci's lives, and as Saskia said, a vision of Gramsci's symptoms, and see if we can find them also on other people. And the reason why we didn't want to focus specifically on Gramsci's body is probably Saskia, you wanna add that?
Yes. Well, one of the reasons why we want to look at the body of both Gramsci in his writings, but also the other bodies surrounding him, is also to emphasize how intellectual activity or being an intellectual like Gramsci does not mean that there's one exceptional mind somewhere floating above reality, but to really historicize and thinking also Gramsci's thinking, and to emphasize also the relationalities and the fact that he was also a body who was loved and depending on others and in relation to others and in exchange with others, and not just one exceptional brilliant mind walking around or floating around somewhere. So this is why we wanted to emphasize his body, but also showing that it's just one body amongst other bodies. He was a body as well.
Of course, yeah, this sort of thing describes a general social, physical, and biological kind of condition that's shared by in the Sardinian context. So it's like, regardless of one's status within this particular society, there's various hardships that come about as a result of like the internal colonialism, as kind of Gramsci famously calls it.
But also, for example, of the organic intellectual, the idea that the intellectual remains rooted within their community. So it also fits Gramsci's own words. He also describes somewhere that that the main error of intellectuals is to think that thought can be decoupled from feeling. It's not possible, also from a Gramscian perspective.
Yeah, no, that's great. So you're doing this sort of type of work that Gramsci himself would probably do as well. And you talk about that, you quote that, right? The possibility of a subaltern history and what that would look like. This is kind of like doing it in many ways. And also it negates the great man sort of theory, as well as kind of this gets rid of this like body-mind duality thing going on, right? So I was wondering, before we get specifically into sort of like Gramsci's kind of like context within the prison and like, the cups that he kind of makes as well, which was really wonderful and fascinating to read. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this, just the 19th and 20th century kind of Sardinian experience, this idea of the Southern question, and also how Sardinians sort of played a role as racialized subjects within a colonial situation, and also still do.
Yeah. I don't know, I can say something. So one of the most famous phrases about the Italian unification is, now that we have made Italy, we have to make the Italians, which is ascribed to Massimo d'Azeglio, and it's a phrase that you always hear when you read about the unification of Italy, and it very well expresses this idea that this unification historically was a project from above in a way, or thought out by a certain group of people, also literally from above, as in from the north. And the south has been described by Gramsci as an internal colony. Many people did not want to be part of Italy. They were not Italians. They had to be created. And the South especially has been very much exploited in favor of the North historically. And not only economically, but also in terms of racialization. And one quote that we have from Gramsci in the article was that Gramsci describes that the Sardinians are called sos sardos molentes, so those Sardinian donkeys, and very much dehumanized also on a cultural, linguistic level. And maybe you want to add something more about Sardinia, Mauro.
No, yeah, this is great, Saskia. It's funny how Sardos Molentes has also become let's say a way to talk about themselves, about Sardinians in a cute. They have appropriated somehow this derogatory expression in a cute way, as in a very elegant and very clean, but also very stubborn animal, which you can trick only once. That's how they say it goes. So it's been kind of flipped around, this negative stereotype, and is owned by people in Sardinia. Yeah, I can only back up what Saskia says about the sovereign question. Italy needed to be made, and then Italian people inhabiting it needed to be shaped. And shaping is sometimes a very violent process. Often, when you want to create an identity that puts together millions of people, you will have to either ask or force someone to renounce their specificities. And we saw it with in old history of nations and nationalisms. And in the specific case of Sardinia, this also meant dehumanizing scientifically specific bodies and phenomena, like the phenomenon of delinquency in the area is at some point studied next to ideas of some people's predisposition to criminality. And still today, in the museum dedicated to famous anthropologist, philosopher Cesare Lombroso, photos of young kids from Sardinia classified simply as little Sardinian criminal, piccolo criminale sardo, are still exposed without further definition or explanation. So in a way, it's a sort of inner colonization process that keeps giving its showing its signs, and is still in place, of course in many different ways, and non-violent at all, as it might have been a century ago, or as it might be right now elsewhere. But it still manifests in the difficulty, for example, or the shame of some people to speak their Sardinian language. Often colonization starts from language, and even just me being from Sardinia, from Southwest Sardinia, I was explicitly told by my parents to avoid speaking Sardinian in public. Their nice language was Italian, whereas Sardinian sounded rough and a bit rude even. And but thankfully, my grandparents could only speak Sardinian, so I was raised bilingual. But not everyone is lucky enough. And Gramsci really conceives of this idea of how many layers of colonization there can be when a nation is shaped, that probably represents many lives in his period, and still resonates quite familiar with many today.
And maybe to add to what you said about Cesare Lombroso, this famous criminalist, and Gramsci, also referring to Lombroso and others, describes that it was common at the time. I thought I'd cite something from his notebook on the history of subaltern social groups. Gramsci writes that instead of studying the origins of a collective event and the reason why it was widespread, why it was collective, one isolated the protagonist and limited oneself to producing his pathological biography. So, to a social elite, the components of subaltern groups always have something barbaric or pathological about them. And this is also why we again wanted to focus on the body and the collective dimension of health and bodies. Because also Gramsci notes that this individualizing and pathologizing of health questions, of matters of life and death, if you want, of bodies, instead of addressing the collective structures underlying those issues, was already then happening in the form of internal colonialism. But I also think we can see many similar examples today, of course, of this rejection of the collective responsibility and the collective nature of bodies, of how they function, and of health.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know it's almost like sort of also hegemonic forms of history, like ruling classes creating forms of history has to pathologize to also sort of like redeem itself too as the savior in many ways. Also like obfuscates class consciousness in many different ways. Focusing on a collective body too, like there's a sense in which this creates solidarity across the Sardinian or any context and situation, where it's really interesting. It's no longer sort of like class distinctions, but rather a sort of shared bodily context in which everyone's dealing with the same sort of or different levels of pain in different ways. So it creates like a deep, almost like felt sense of sort of solidarity that's happening. And one thing that I also thought was really interesting, very clear places where you saw the ways in which the Sardinian sort of, I guess, body was as a result of internal colonization had and played a different role sort of historically, right? You kind of cite figures with World War I deaths and access to healthcare, mortality rates. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these sort of figures and statistics and the relevance for Gramsci's own writing, how these weigh on that.
Do you want to go, Saskia, or shall I?
Maybe you want to start?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's we kind of you see, Lee, again, Saskia and I coming from different backgrounds. We tried, as Saskia explained beautifully earlier, to look at bones as words and to look at written symptoms as physical things. And indeed, a doctor today would first of all ask to a patient for their symptoms to know how to operate, to start with the diagnosis. So they really, words assume, acquire a very bodily dimension in Gramsci and in everyone really. And so we kind of felt the urge to keep bouncing off each other. We look at Gramsci's writings. It all makes sense when then we look at the bodies we are analyzing, the paleopathologies, the markers are showing a sort of alignment with the way Gramsci talks about the people of his time, the lack of nutrients or the very heavy work. For example, one of the case studies we look at, it's let's say we're looking at the elbow, at the humerus bone, and so we are in the area of the arm. The elbow is completely affected by numerous movements that strain the ligament and almost erased the natural shape of the bones that allows the articulation to move the arm. And we were struck of how the symptoms Gramsci describes, well, actually, Gramsci's sister, right, describes their mother's symptoms when she works long nights to iron shirts with a very heavy iron after a whole day of work. And like these two images, written and physical, the humerus that we have preserved from Lacuni, a city nearby Alice, they really, I mean, they could be actually one the humerus of the other, or the story of Gramsci's mother could have been the story of the person who owned it humerus. So when we're doing that, we are faced by a sort of empathic mentality towards these people who were going through whatever they were going through. It was very hard also to think of them. But at the same time, there is a sort of enthusiasm in us as writers, as researchers. And we're like, wow, we're finding a lot of things that make sense. So probably we felt the urge to expand even farther. But and so that's why the urge to look at statistics that come from medical studies of late 19th century and early 20th century people's lives. How were they recruited in the army? How many of them died in proportion compared to other regions? And how many of them, for example, how many men were excluded from taking service in the army because of pathologies that they could have only acquired if exposed to very poor nutrition and very heavy labor since they were children. So when we look at these statistics and numbers that we put in the paper, we are faced with a narrative that is perfectly fitting both Gramsci's descriptions and the bones we look at. Of course, we should also say these specific bones were preserved by the University of Cagliari because of the specific pathologies they preserve. They still show. So they were kept as samples of a specific illness, and they are used to teach students specific illnesses and how they manifest in the bones. So there were of course probably even more bones that were not collected because they were perfectly healthy. So we're not saying every single person suffered from these specific conditions, but they were very widespread, because if in the clearance of one ossuary of not many graves you still find so many specific pathologies, then something is going on at the broader level. And that's why we looked at the statistics, and we found out that actually Sardinia had a specific place in the heart of Italian activities, not only exploited in terms of lands and resources like minerals and grains, but also in the way the bodies of people were used in the army and in specific other circumstances.
And I think again we were also surprised to find that Gramsci already had thought of these things in a way. For example, in a letter to his mother from 1931, Gramsci writes, "If malaria easily gives rise to tuberculosis, it means that the population is undernourished. I would like Grazietta to tell me what is eaten over the course of a week by a family of Zoronadeiros, workers paid on a daily basis, of Masaios a meitade," sorry Mauro, you should have pronounced this, of small landowners who work their own land, of shepherds with sheep that take up all their time, and the family of artisans, a shoemaker or blacksmith. If Aunt Maria Gulcartigo were alive, we could find out quickly, but with a bit of patience, if it were possible. How many times a week do they eat meat, and how much? Or don't they eat any? How do they make soup? How much oil or fat do they put in? How many legumes, pasta, etc.? How much wheat do they grind? Or how many kilos of bread do they buy? How much coffee or substitutes for coffee? How much sugar? How much milk for the children, etc.? So already in Gramsci we see this idea to look at the food and the health of a population and the other circumstances. All the time it was a dialogue between the text, the bones, Gramsci again, another testimony of someone else, an object. All the time we were thinking we had some brilliant idea, and then actually Gramsci wrote this already.
It was actually incredible when you, Saskia, found this passage, because I was like very pleased, and at the same time it was like, damn, but he's already doing it. Like it's incredible. It's so, aware of how the bodies are entangled with the world around them. So a symptom is because of a habit, and the habit is because someone is either allowing you to have access to certain resources or not. And how do you deal with this? It's shaping your bones, your body, your lifestyle. It's just so ahead of its time. I don't know. Fantastic.
No, I mean, I feel the same way with a lot of this writing as well. Even if it seems sort of like mundane, the most mundane is also the most profound at times as well. Like the ordinary becomes extraordinary, the extraordinary becomes ordinary, right? That sort of thing. And this continual going back and forth, it's like I found the bones to be sort of the objective condition of the subjective experience. So like the subjective experience is sort of rehashing, rewriting, and studying this particular situation, and the bones are sort of pointing to it as a sort of thing. If it needs to be empirically verified, like in a positivistic sense, it's like you can look at that particular stuff, right? But then there's also experience of it too. And it seems like within this sort of like colonial situation, feeling the effects, there's a colonial affect happening, right? So it's like feeling the starvation and feeling like, there's this process of extraction from your land returns to the process of denial to the body. So the more extractivism that happens, the less you actually consume. And Gramsci is sort of interestingly like acting as a sort of like an anthropologist, kind of like getting into what's going on and the cause. And he's also like, I think, preemptively thinking about what a potential like socialist government could look like in terms of planning as well. So it's like he's surveying the areas and he's looking at agriculture, and it almost feels like a Milcar Cabral or something, like how much needs to be grown, when and where and for whom, sort of thing, right? And I mean, to me, it's like he's very much like in this organizational mode. A lot of the Gramscian sort of prison notebooks, like you're reading it, has to do with the party. And I feel like this is also like, what a socialist sort of government and a food system could do and look like as well. So I think that's also very hopeful as well. And to keep up a sort of intellectual and academic curiosity and rigor while being in a prison is amazing to me. Absolutely amazing. I teach in a prison, and the fact that there are students to teach in a prison is amazing to me. Just like showing up, I mean, just being there. So studying and doing this thing and caring about people was a way in which Gramsci kept his human being alive within these like completely demoralizing conditions. And I guess towards that end, it's really interesting to think about where Gramsci's body has ultimately been, or buried, or cremated. So I was wondering if you could talk about, because, well, Gramsci does this a lot. He thinks about the particular and the universal. So it's like sort of by looking at his own and another person's condition, you could actually see the collective totality of a class, and the class eventually will see it for themselves through the organic intellectual kind of thing. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where Gramsci's buried and sort of why. I found that to be particularly interesting and insightful.
Yeah, I can say something about that. So his remains are buried in Rome in the Cimitero Acattolico per i Stranieri, so the non-Catholic cemetery for strangers or foreigners. Actually, for this is the translation. So he's buried in a cemetery for non-Catholic foreigners, in between mostly English people, men. And we thought this was so indicative of also all the paradoxes in his legacy and his life. That on the one hand he was this marginal figure with a body that wasn't functioning well all the time. We could maybe call him disabled or sickly, or so he was very much marginalized in this sense, if you like. He didn't have enough to eat. He also grew up in poverty, not absolute poverty, but he knew what poverty was like. He was from the south. He spoke Sardinian also at home. And on the other hand, he became this political leader on a national stage, but also internationally, this great intellectual who was being read around the world. He became a national martyr, like the image of anti-fascism in Italy. And so he's all the time sort of in between the margins and the center, and outside and inside. And now what remains of him physically is amongst foreigners, Anglophone foreigners, just like his legacy has taken a whole other direction in the Anglophone academic world than his legacy in Italy. But it's in Rome. It's the center of the nation. It's the city of the Vatican. It's Rome, the eternal city. So we thought this was such a strong place to put this weird person's body, or like this great intellectual who was just a body, who was all the time and this and that. We thought this was such an interesting place to put him. or we thought it's such a characterizing image that what remains of his body is there in between strangers at the heart of Italy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it brings to mind kind of like the Leninist sort of quote where it's like, once a person is dead, they become safe. They become a sort of figure. They become an icon. So he was like safe to bury there in some way. And for hegemonic Italian society to accept, to utilize his ideas for various ends. Now that he's sort of gone, he's not like a danger, right? But his tools and his image is very useful kind of for putting Italian academics and philosophers, et cetera, on the map as well. And, it's also part of like the kind of post-war memory as well. It's like there's the politics of memory. So Italy sort of generally claims like an anti-fascist kind of legacy, even though it's got this like moment with Mussolini. And then there's the myth of like the good Italian, the good, Italian. So, I think like burying him there plays a role in the politics of memory and what is sort of upheld as a memory, right? That's kind of like a large thing that happens, right? There's like, so that sort of thing plays a large role. Now, we know that Gramsci was in prison, but we don't know much about the prison system in Italy during that time and sort of like what he was up to in there. So it'd be cool to sort of dig into that rather than being like, he was this political philosopher that was in prison. It's like, okay, but like, what was prison like? And what did he do in there also? Because he talks about that to his family members, to comrades in his letters, as you kind of quote and point out. It was really cool stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. He really does allow us to have a glimpse into ordinary life in prison, not only in a specific cell. He describes with a lot of attention for details how big the window is, called bocca di lupo, wolf's mouth, how much sunshine will enter in his room in the summertime, and how hot the room, his small room, will become. He will describe how big it is, meter by meter, and they are very like enough for a bed to be in there and for a person to stand up and move towards the door. And at the same time, it's really curious and endearing the way he finishes very excruciating descriptions of life in prison. I don't have this to eat. I don't have that. I don't even have coffee. And the room is too hot. But hopefully they will move me to another cell. But everything is all right. It will always end on a positive note, but probably they will move me somewhere. But it is better than the previous cell. Or there is an episode in which he says, but it is surely better than the way certain kids were kept in Sardinia in very poor circumstances. So he always finds a way to relate himself to other people's material lives and to not feel like the exceptionally treated human being or mistreated, and on the other hand to allow people who are receiving the letter and probably will be already crying and feel pain when reading the first line. It will always end like, don't worry about it, it's fine, I'm dealing with it fine, and there is someone who is worse off anyway. But yeah, he describes several meals, for example, and the lack of food. And there is a scene that he describes when every one of his comrades are hopeful for Christmas time. They hope to have a broth, and then they offer them just a portion of little broth and bread. There is no meat, and it describes in minutiae, really, in the details, the feeling of a person, like avidly almost, or hopefully, trying to, with a crumb of bread, trying to soak up the last drop of broth so that they can enjoy this sort of family moment and special meal during Christmas. It is heartbreaking, really, most of it, and then it comes up with very funny episodes at the same time that all of a sudden not only allow you to empathize with the human being that the system is dehumanizing and depriving of their objects and tools and foods and vision and possibility to look at the landscape, but it will try to fight back. It will try to push back and create something that rehumanizes him. I don't know. I think it's inspiring because many people live probably in very similar situations around the world, and their lives are not known enough. He helps at least to ask questions of the people who are living in similar situations even today.
And Mauro found a lovely passage in the letters. I have it here. When he writes to his sister-in-law Tatiana, I did not receive the Cheerio preserves, nor the chocolate, nor the pound cake, all of which were not allowed. I saw them marked on the list, but with the notation that they could not pass. So I did not have the small glass for the coffee, but I took care of it by constructing a set of 6 eggshells superbly mounted on pedestals of kneaded bread. So he took the bread, he took the eggshells, and then made 6 coffee cups, which was a lovely find.
Yeah, that was great. And the 6 was so specific because that's the amount you get in a set as well. So he keeps his sense of Sardinian culture, like he's creating and being Sardinian within this prison confined place where it's like they dehumanize you to the point where like you're kind of dizzy in some way. But somehow this relates, like I was thinking about like this is like the sort of optimism of the heart, pessimism of the will kind of thing. Where when he signs off letters, he's like, don't worry about it. I got this.
Actually, you, Lee, caught probably one of the cores of this passage that Saskia read. The 6, like it wasn't about creating a coffee cup to have coffee. It was about creating 6, like the set that you will have in a normal Italian house or Sardinian house, to allow people to come in, and because you wouldn't make coffee for one person, you do the whole cafetiera for a few, at least 2 people. So this is really, I don't know, sweet and inspiring, and at the same time so strong and resilient, because it's saying, you know what? No, I will create this situation anyway, and this is how probably we felt that it was so important to look at objects as well. This is how embodied objects are in the way we see ourselves. It wouldn't have been enough to create 1 cup, but 6 recreated a...
And also the humor is important, I think, here. Also, they were not just mounted. He did not mount some eggshells on pieces of bread. They were superbly mounted. So we can also see that there's some humor, some love for life, I would say.
Absolutely. Imagine the energy. Yeah, superbly.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, also just having the 6 cups reminds you of all the people you could be in dialogue with and have been in dialogue with the past. And these objects, like as you write, once you're in prison, take on different meanings. Like when there's an eggshell or something that's been outside of the prison, so then bring it into the prison, the eggshell or these other objects have a sense of like aura, and like almost like a Benjaminian sense. But Mauro, I know you have to go soon, so if you just have to run, that's totally fine. But okay, you got a little bit of time. Okay, great. Yeah, again, feel free, right? So there was one part. I mean, this whole thing was really fascinating, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like within prison abolitionist sort of text and scholarship, we know that they talk a lot about movement, and the controlling of movement is a way to control sort of population, when and where and how. I've seen this kind of like directly again in like teaching in prisons, like they can't study because there's like a move or there's something going on. But during Ramadan, they actually kind of take over and reschedule the prison in their own in different ways. So that's actually something really interesting. Like they get to use an alternative set of time because of actually like struggles for religion to be used in prison, like where they could practice religion. They actually like can then reroute and reframe it to conform to their own set of time. So time becomes weirdly enough a form of resistance during Ramadan, which is super cool and interesting. But I was wondering if you could talk about like sort of the movement of him. Like they forcibly bring these people on different ships, on different places, and then take them to different areas. And ultimately, like it's a form of sort of like physical and mental torture, really, it seems like. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Shall I go, Saskia, or do you want to?
I think maybe I can start with the fact that he first, after being what's it called? After being imprisoned or after being captured, he first thought that he would probably be sent to Somalia, to the colonies far away. But then eventually he was sent to the internal colony, the island of Ustica. And maybe you want to take it from there, Mauro.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I don't think there is better words than Gramsci's themselves to describe this movement, these transfers from one prison to the other prison that the fascist system had in place. He says with a very specific image. Just imagine that an immense worm slithers from Palermo to Milan, a worm that continually breaks up and comes together again, leaving parts of its rings in each prison, reforming new ones, tossing the same parts to right and left, and then reincorporating the extractions. This worm has layers in each prison, which accumulate the dirt and misery of generations, clothing them together. You arrive tired, dirty, your wrists hurting because of the long hours in manacles, and your face a long stubble, your hair disheveled, eyes sunk deep and glittering both from the excitation of strained, fatigued, and sleeplessness. You fling yourself on the pallets that are who knows how old, fully dressed, so as not to come into contact with the filth, wrapping your face and hands in your towels, covering yourself with the skimpy blankets just to avoid freezing. Then you leave again, dirtier and weaker for the next transit, and your wrists are even more bruised because of the cold irons and the weight of the chains and the effort of carrying, thus decked out your own luggage. But, again, let us be patient. Now it is all over, and I've already rested. It is quite incredible how he describes in a very, very vivid image the carceral system of the fascist prison. And bear in mind, he starts earlier and it tells you later as well how these transfers work. It was clear that it was being transferred from Palermo to Ustica several times, very early in the morning, with a very wavy sea, very high winds. There was no possibility for the boat to reach Ustica, but they were still loaded onto the boat, made them wait. All of them felt sick and then come back again up to Palermo, and then they will try again 4 hours later and a day later. So this is a real machine fought carefully by a fascist state to dehumanize all prisoners, and in particular a political prisoner.
And on the other, and at the same time, not on the other hand, but at the same time, the lack of movement, the lack of freedom of movement, and this time regime also in some way made sure that we still have Gramsci's thoughts from prison, the letters and the notebooks. Because before his imprisonment, Gramsci was mostly writing as a journalist. He was active as a politician, and he wanted to write for the day, that day in time. And it didn't have to be. He didn't need to be an author of like books for eternity. Or he was writing as a journalist mostly. And then when he was in prison, he wrote in a very famous letter that now he wanted to write something für ewig, that he took from Goethe, so for forever. And his writing changed a lot. Of course, for various reasons, he was not able to write like before. And this also, in a way, is kind of, I think, the revenge of Gramsci's imprisonment, because at his trial, it was said that someone at the trial said, we must make sure that this brain will stop functioning for the next 20 years. So they thought his brain was very dangerous, and they wanted to silence his brain, stop his brain from working for the next 20 years. But in fact, this imprisonment made sure that he wrote für ewig, and that this brain did not stop function at all. And that instead he wrote all these notes that today are the prison notebooks, and that made him so famous. So it's this weird paradox again, in a way.
Yeah, for sure. Like sometimes clamping down on sort of resistance actually causes more resistance in many different ways. Like once you clamp down on something, people are more motivated to do something about that. We see that in the U.S. context, like right now, very much so in different ways. And this, like the worm business is super interesting. Just the imagery and like going back to the animal. I was also thinking about like, when you said the donkey thing, it made me also think that donkeys are used as a technology of labor too, in the same way that Sardinians are also used as a form of labor in different ways. But this worm coming back together and then not coming back together, it's a singular and collective thing. That's always kind of happening, right? And he's seeing himself within a group, always like a part of this larger sort of worm, right? And worms like wiggle through systems too, right? And they have like these kind of movements that humans can't necessarily do. So the worm gives room for freedom as well. So there's definitely like within this imagery, there's something liberatory as well. And it's also super interesting. I don't know if that works. It's just an idea.
Absolutely. I think
stuff
you really put together the two worlds with this zoological metaphor. Absolutely.
Great. I'm glad it made sense. But then also, this idea of sort of weighing down too. So he's always bringing in the body. When he's handcuffed, you could see most likely see these markers if you were to look at this person's bones, right? So by looking at the physical, you could see the social, right? There's no separation between the two of these things, right? The subjective experience and the objective conditions come together within this form of like a bio-archaeological writing and study that you guys are interested in doing. And I thought that was, very powerful to bridge these two. It's usually very hard to do this thing. So I thought, this is a great way to go about it. And
thank you.
Yeah. And the other thing is obviously like the prison censors and whatnot. So he has got to write differently for all of these sorts of things. Like this is a thing that constantly happens. But I know you guys got to run. I don't want to take too much of your time. I would be remiss if we didn't ask about the picture of Gramsci, the famous sort of portrait, and then what your analysis says and does with the famous sort of picture and portrait. And then we could say goodbye and all these things. Yeah.
I say something, or what do we? Okay. So the famous picture of Gramsci, it's from the early 1920s. And what we can see is just that it's a young man with a smooth face, intelligent look. His hair is combed. He looks like a proper, as you would imagine, maybe the perfect intellectual, if you wish. And then around the edges, his body is faded out, so we only see the head. And this is the famous, or one of the most famous images of Gramsci. Whereas other images also of later, also during imprisonment, are usually not remembered because they're just less beautiful, as we think, and they are less the perfect image. So we read this picture as a form of disembodiment of his thought, in a way in which he only is a head, but not also a writing body. Whereas I guess the point of one of the points of our article is that writing always happens somewhere and in somebody. in relation to others and an environment. So we wanted to, desanitize, we call it, decolonize Gramsci's intellect, his head, his body.
Yeah, absolutely. And taking all the objects that we saw now, Lee, the handcuffs and the fact that he was exposed to child labor, so he was working for someone. So all of this body that is represented, as Saskia says, as a perfect face and image, and it is waved in the flags, even in some political parties, which is great. But it is kind of emptying the value of the bodily relationships that Gramsci had with the people around him in prison and in Sardinia and in Albania, where his family is from, and elsewhere. Because it never allows you to box him into a specific category. So like there are so many Gramscis that are not familiar to people, and they are probably easier to find in people who are familiar to others, just like in the normal ways that people run their lives. And that's probably what we try to kind of close the gap with. And we thought it was the decolonizing operation, because often, for instance, I've never been exposed to Gramsci's thought in Sardinia myself, but to Gramsci's image a lot. I was exposed to Gramsci's thought when I came to university much later in England, as in I find his books on the shelves in the bookshops a lot more than I find them that I found them when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s in Sardinia. So this is also like a need of, probably that's why it's in the cemetery for foreigners as well. Like it makes all sense in the end.
Yeah, and also I've been so surprised when I read some of Gramsci's works on the internal colony with, for example, students from Brazil. They always immediately, they're immediately captured by this description and say, yes, this is exactly what my country feels like now. So you can see that the lived experience is also very recognizable or similar and very situated at the same time. That was one thing. And I thought maybe we could also kind of semi-end with some words by Gramsci. From Notebook 7. It is also true that man is what he eats, as far as food supply is one of the expressions of the social relations as a whole, and every social grouping has their own fundamental food supply. But similarly, one can say that man is his apartment. Man is his particular way of reproducing, that is, his family. Because food supply, clothing, housing, reproduction are the elements of social life in which exactly, in the most evident and diffuse ways, that the totality of social relations manifests itself. So I'm very much aware of all these material surroundings of what a man or woman or person is.
Yeah, brilliant. I found like he's so good at sort of looking at the base and superstructure and seeing them so deeply intertwined, like seeing the whole within one thing. I mean, and he's also just such an excellent writer as well. So thank you guys so much. I know there's so much more to talk about with this. So everyone go read it. We could not cover everything here unless we had 3-4 hours, which, isn't the maybe ideal. But anyway, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being here. Is there any works that you're working on that you want to shout out, or where can people keep up with your stuff? That sort of thing.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you for having us. I think we'll keep working on this. It's a beginning, and it's something we will keep. We would love keep doing, both in terms of bioarchaeological approaches, osteobiography, and looking at other intellectual figures as well, because like the point is to probably connect rather than be like creating a one-off work.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.